Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm going to be looking at how to counter Doom in Timeline on manual play. I've had to face him a lot of times in Timeline Challenger when I'm going for top 5, so I thought I'd share my tips on how to beat him, as well as the top characters that you can use to make the fight as easy as possible. In order to emphasize how good these characters that I'm going to showcase are to counter Doom, I tried to make the Doom team that I'm facing as tough as possible, so I'm facing my own team with a brilliant CTP of Authority Doom, which has the steal effect up to about, I believe, 50% damage mitigation. Since most people are likely going to use Ebony Maw on the team to get that increased damage mitigation versus universal types, I also included him on the team too. That is to say, on the team that I'm fighting and not my own team. My own team will only consist of a debuff leadership like Sentry and no support or anything else in the third slot, just a random third character. The order that I'm going to be showing the characters off in is a little bit of an indication of how hard they are to play to how easy they are to play. In essence, it's kind of like a ranking of these counter characters, but I also take into account how consistent they are to get that easy win. You might not agree with my quote-unquote ranking, but that's completely fine, because that also depends on your builds and the opponents you're facing. So just make sure to keep that in mind when watching the video. If you're wondering why I even made this video, it's because Doom is arguably the best character in Timeline for offense, and if you get into Challenger, for defense as well. Not to call out any specific names here, but in Challenger there's a revenge system, so you can see if the opponent failed your team or not. So every time you see victory is when my opponent failed to beat the Doom set that I had. Mind you that this is when the character was out for the first month or so people were still trying to figure out how to counter him. By now, many people might have figured out how to deal with him, but I thought I'd mention my method just in case. Unless you immediately spam iframe ignore skills very close to Doom in the beginning of the fight, he'll always go into his 4th skill first, and then into his 5th skill. Knowing this, the way that I deal with Doom is to have my main damage dealer or my counter in the 2nd or 3rd slot. And then when Doom starts off the fight with his 4th skill, I use the character in my lead spot. Usually it's a character that has debuff and is kind of quick, hopefully Sentry if he's available that week. And I dodge his 4th skill, and then when he's right about to do the missile in his 5th skill, I swap to my counter character. Note the path that I take to dodge the 4th skill. I first move away from him so he gets closer, and then when he begins his iframe, I move sort of in an arc around him and through him, and then away to avoid the damage. If you end up doing this maneuver properly, you'll take little to no damage at all. It's important you move as far away as you can after you've dodged the 4th, since he'll launch towards you for the final hit of the 4th skill. If you haven't tried this method out before, you'll probably just end up moving away from him till he starts his iframe and then just moving sideways. But the AoE is so massive that you'll take a lot of splash damage, and if the opponent is very strong, you might lose as much as half your health. In terms of when to switch out your character to avoid the 5th skill damage, you want to do so after he goes invisible and has started the rocket animation. You can do it right when he goes invisible or a little bit after, but it's really important that you do it after he's gone invisible. Otherwise, the 5th skill will persist and you'll take a lot of damage and likely lose your character. After this has occurred, you're going to go into your iframe ignore skill, which all of these counter characters have in common. Unfortunately, Dormammu is kind of at the end of the easiest to counter since he is a universal type, so Maw is going to limit his damage a bit. And because it's reflect based damage, you're going to have to take a certain number of hits before you can take down Doom. As you can see with the regen build on Dormammu and no damage proc, I am able to take down Doom, but his 4th skill kind of interrupts Doom from his 5th skill and makes him go directly into damage skills, which can be tricky and make Dormammu kind of inconsistent. Crescent is one of the newest characters that can counter Doom, and although she is pretty good, she does have some setbacks similar to Dormammu. Firstly, the 2nd skill, which is the counter, needs to have a hit from the enemy, otherwise the counter aspect won't activate. So if you try to swap her out after the 5th skill, the 2nd skill won't really do anything. Besides that, it still seems to be a little bit buggy in that you can't activate it when the opponent is in an iframe. at least not all the time when you should be able to. One way you can go around the second skill needing a hit to activate the counter is to simply swap into Crescent before Dr. Doom goes invisible. Just keep in mind to run away from the missile damage afterwards. You can see an example of that in the second spawn when I just activate the second skill and it immediately takes out Doom. Some quick tips when using Crescent: try to activate your fifth skill whenever you can, since it gives you that 85% penetration to all sources and does a high amount of damage. Besides this, when Doom goes into his second spawn, try to use the third skill first to go into your iframe and avoid that initial burst damage. Then you can simply go into your 2, and because you have that penetration from before, it should instantly take out Doom. As you can see, Crescent is pretty good, even with the CTP of regen. She can tank Doom, and she can burst him pretty quickly with the damage accumulation from the second skill and the high burst damage from the fifth skill. Not to mention that she can go through multiple build types on Doom, including the CTP of Authority, because of her penetration to all sources on her fifth skill. And to add to that, the combat type makes it so you don't have to worry about Ma's passive lowering your damage. The reason that she's second lowest on the list is because her second skill is a bit buggy, it needs to take damage to activate, and because you have a summon, Doom can pretty much always hit you, so it's tricky to avoid damage with your own iframes. Rogue is next on the list because she's very similar to Crescent in that her third skill, iframe counter skill, needs to take damage for it to activate. The only difference for her is that she has the damage accumulation and the penetration built into that single skill, so you don't have to worry about fumbling other skills to take out a Doom that has a CTP of Authority, for example. Besides this, the third skill, damage accumulation, is based off damage dealt as opposed to received, so it should make the one-shot versus Doom a lot easier to do. Once you take out Doom, and if you're able to take down Sentry as well, you also have the benefit of Rogue being a speed type and being able to easily counter Ma. You can see that Rogue is pretty versatile since I'm not even using a CTP of Authority or a regen for her. I have a CTP of Judgment, and it does make it a little bit tricky to dodge the fifth damage afterwards, but you can make it work. Ideally, you want something like a regen or authority, since that guard break immunity will help you from getting stun locked from the fifth skill splash damage. Hulk is next on the list because he's a lot tankier than the other characters, and if anything goes wrong, you could potentially void a possible loss. Also, unlike the previous characters, you don't have to rely on getting hit for the third skill to be effective in doing a one-shot. One of the noticeable downsides of using Hulk, though, is that you're more than likely going to be using a CTP of regen for him, so you're going to have 0 penetration, and if you face a Doom that has a CTP of Authority or Invincible, you're going to need to do a second hit after you do your third skill that has the iframe ignore. The best skill you can use for that is the second skill, since it's so fast hitting. As a quick tip for fighting Doom's second life, try to open up with an iframe ignore skill, again to try to avoid some of that initial damage from the fifth. Then obviously go into your iframe ignore skill being the third, and then use your other skills, preferably your second, to take him out quickly, or if he goes into his iframe again, go into your third skill to basically finish him off. Luke Cage is essentially like a safer version of Hulk, since you can get that added survival and damage from Jessica Jones's passive. Besides this, the fifth skill gives you that damage accumulation when you go into the iframe ignore, which is so high damage, especially with Jessica Jones's passive, that it can basically one-shot Doom even if he has an invincible on. Another reason why Luke Cage ends up being safer than Hulk is because he has that awaken skill, so if the opponent hasn't taken you out after 30 seconds, you can essentially one-shot them with that skill. You can see that I'm using Luke in the leadership position since he does get that debuff removal, but also because you want to take a little bit of damage when you activate the third skill to get that damage accumulation before going into your own fifth skill for that iframe ignore and potential one-shot against Doom. If you don't use him in the leadership position and swap in after the fifth skill, you're not really going to be able to do much, and then Doom's going to follow up with a lot of damage. If you don't use Jessica Jones as support, his damage and survival does drop a lot, so he could possibly be ranked under Hulk in that case. Regardless, you can see that even with a CTP of regen build, you should be able to take out Doom. Shang-Chi might be just a little bit trickier to use than Luke Cage, but he does end up being more consistent, and he doesn't require a support like Jessica Jones to perform as well as he does. Basically, all you have to do with Shang-Chi is use his third skill, but the timing on when you use the third skill is the part that might be a little bit tricky, and the fact that you kind of have to run around to avoid the damage from Doom's fifth skill on his second life. But like the characters before, having a regen or authority, I'm personally using authority, should be enough to take out a Doom, so you don't need a damage proc. Some quick tips for using Shang-Chi: after you've dodged Doom's fifth skill, immediately go into your third skill, and that should one-shot any Doom that's using a regen. If they're using an authority instead, by the time that they come out of the iframe, your third skill should be back up, allowing you to get the first kill. After that, try to get as far away from Doom as you can to give you enough time for the third skill to be up. When Doom goes back into his fifth skill, you might want to hold off using the third skill till you're around the 50% or possibly 75% health mark, since you're going to take a lot of damage and you want the heal from the third skill to fill your health back up to full. Try to dodge the damage from the fifth skill if you can by running away from it or going into another iframe skill like your first or fifth skill. Then using your third skill again should finish off the fight. Also, if it isn't already apparent, I haven't seen the movie yet, so that's why I keep making the mistake of calling Shang-Chi Shang-Chi. Didn't really feel like re-recording that whole part again, so yeah, sorry about that, but when I watch the movie, it probably won't happen again. Also, the other reason why Shang-Chi is higher ranked than the previous characters is because it's so easy to take out the other characters besides Doom. Even though Silver Surfer is a universal type, so he does less damage if Ma is on the opponent's team, he gets ranked a little bit higher than Shang-Chi because he does have those 2 lives. In addition to that, he doesn't really need to do anything to get his reflect up, and his counter skill has that penetration built in, so it's almost guaranteed to be a one-shot. My Silver Surfer has a CTP of regen, and he can still perform the one-shot without a necessary damage proc. Tips on how to use him effectively: after you've dodged Doom's fifth skill, you don't want to use the third skill, since there's going to be no hits for you to be able to effectively activate the third skill. Instead, you want to use the fifth skill immediately after Doom comes out of his skill, and then go into your third skill, which should be a one-shot with the 5 and 3 combo. After that, like Shang-Chi, you want to move far away to get time to get your third skill back up, and then after you see Doom activate his fifth skill, don't use the third skill immediately, but wait a little bit after the rocket has launched, and then do the third skill, so you don't get locked out or CC'd out of the third skill counter. The reason that I put Supergiant just a bit ahead of Silver Surfer is because she's easier to pull off that one shot than he is. I'm using a CTP of authority here, and all I really have to do is use the fifth skill and then immediately go into the third skill, iframe ignore. She has 50% native penetration to all sources on her uniform, so even if the opponent Doom has a CTP of authority, it doesn't matter because she'll go through that invincible anyway. Besides this, her iframe ignore skill is up more frequently and quicker than Silver Surfer's, and doesn't require a hit to activate. Quicksilver, being a speed type and not having his damage reduced from Ebony Maw's passive, is one of the reasons why he's ahead of Supergiant in terms of a Doom counter. With his newest uniform, he can easily one-shot Doom. All you really have to do is spam the fourth skill, iframe ignore. I can't say for sure if he is able to one-shot with something like a CTP of regen or authority, since I'm using a CTP of greed. Just as a quick note for using Quicksilver, you don't really need to use the third skill to get that damage accumulation. The first time around, you can just use the fourth skill, and then on Doom's second life, go into the fifth skill, so you go into an iframe and avoid that burst damage, and it'll give you that 1 to 2 seconds time for your fourth skill to come back up, and immediately go into that to finish off the second kill. Although Quicksilver is an easy counter to Doom because of that one-shot capability, he does sometimes knock Doom out of his skills, which allows him to counter him and one-shot him in return. So ironically, Doom himself is a slightly better counter to himself if you know how to play him right, and because he has those 2 lives. Ideally, you want to use your own Doom with supports to counter the Ebony Maw and possible Colossus on the other team. After you've dodged the opponent Doom's fourth skill, you want to move as far away as possible to get the cooldown off of your skills, and then when the opponent Doom goes into his fifth skill, you want to use your fourth skill as fast as you can, and then the moment just before the 4th skill hits the opponent or the ground, you want to go into your 2nd skill, which is your iframe ignore counter. Then move away from the 5th skill damage and the opponent so that you have time to activate your 5th skill at the same time as your opponent does on their 2nd life. And then when you go invisible, you can go into your 4th skill and then into your 2nd skill right before the 4th touches the ground. The reason that you want to do the 5th skill this time around is obviously to be able to heal, but you're also able to use the 4th skill because there are little gaps in Doom's 5th skill that allow you to go into other skills. So you can stack on more damage to get that guaranteed kill from the 2nd skill. Sentry is a much easier counter to Doom since he's less technical, and because the 5th skill will basically keep Doom locked down for you to burst him quick enough to take him out. The general combo that you want to use to quickly burst Doom is you activate your 5th skill and then immediately go into your 1st skill and then into your 2nd skill. That should give you way more than enough burst damage, even if you're using something like a CTP of Authority or Regen to take out Doom in basically one shot. Captain Marvel comes in as the 2nd best counter to Doom since she does lose a little bit of points considering that she's a universal type, and Ebony Maw lowers or affects her damage versus Doom. Regardless, she should still be able to one-shot Doom with something like a CTP of Destruction, and if you don't have that, she should be able to outlive Doom with something like a CTP of Authority, especially if it has that steal effect that gives you the added mitigation. In fact, if you add something like a Colossus and Ebony Maw support on your own team and have her in the leadership position, even though you don't have that debuff, she basically takes no damage at all versus an enemy Doom. You can see in this fight, I have a CTP of Rage and I'm still able to one-shot an enemy Doom with the Authority because the burst damage is so high. I don't really recommend using Rage for her in PvP, but I have it because I needed to get the max score for squad battle. If you have a CTP of Destruction, it makes it the easiest to play her with because you simply just have to use your 4th skill in both lives and it should instantly one-shot the enemy Doom. Otherwise, if you're using something that doesn't have penetration, you want to use the 4th skill and then just move around and dodge the damage and go back into the 4th skill when it's up again. Finally, the best counter or most reliable takedown versus Doom that I found is Daredevil. Some of the reasons why I ranked him so high is because he doesn't need any supports to work the way that he does. You can really use any build on him. I have a CTP of Regen and he can still one-shot Doom, and besides that, he's a speed type, so he doesn't get any damage penalties or reductions from the opponent using an Ebony Maw. To add to that, he's all around a very good character versus other opponents besides Doom, and his damage and survival can be supercharged further with other supports, including that of Luke Cage and Jessica Jones. The basic strategy that you want to use with Daredevil is that after you've dodged the 4th skill from the enemy Doom, using whatever your leadership is, you swap to Daredevil and immediately go into your 3rd skill. Even though the 3rd skill, iframe ignore counter, requires a hit to activate early, after a set period of time it'll activate by itself and it still should be a one-shot kill. The reason for this is because it has that damage accumulation for damage dealt, it has a damage buff to one skill, and because it has that penetration to all sources, so even if the opponent Doom has a CTP of Authority, you should still be able to take it out, even if you don't have something like a CTP of Destruction equipped. On the 2nd life, you basically want to go into the 5th skill as soon as you can when Doom respawns, and then stay in that skill until you see him go invisible to avoid that initial burst damage and the one that can CC you. Then you can go into the 3rd skill, and the little tick damage that occurs from the 5th skill should be able to proc your 3rd skill, which should immediately activate the counter and take out Doom's 2nd life. So those are the characters that I found were most effective for countering Doom, and you might not necessarily agree with the order like I said, but that really depends on your builds, and you shouldn't have to agree with it. There are other characters that have that iframe ignore and can potentially counter Doom. There's characters like Mephisto, Null, Hulkbuster, and Black Dwarf, but I didn't find these types of characters as consistent as the ones that I mentioned, so I didn't include them in the list. If you feel that I missed a really good counter versus Doom, then make sure to include that in the comments below so other people know as well. Anyways, that pretty much does it for this video. If you liked this style of video, I like a counter to particular characters or maybe even teams, I could do another one like this in the future. I'm considering maybe doing one for defenders if people are interested in that. If you did like this style of video, then please consider liking and possibly subscribing if you want to see more content like this, since it does help my channel grow. Thanks for your time and watching, but the video is now over.